William Crapo Durant founded General Motors. Then General Motors fired him, so he built Durant Motors. Then Wall Street destroyed that too. The man who assembled the greatest industrial empire in American history filed for bankruptcy in 1936 with $900,000 in debt and $250 to his name. At its peak, Durant Motors had 50,000 workers across 10 factories. The star rolled off the line in Lansing, Michigan, a car so competitive that Henry Ford had to cut his prices just to survive. Dealers stretched from coast to coast. For one brief, brilliant moment, Billy Durant had done the impossible a second time. Then the factories went quiet. The workers scattered. And Durant himself ended up washing dishes in a 5-cent hamburger joint, opened inside his own former showroom. How does the man who built General Motors die with nothing? The answer starts on Verlinden Avenue, Lansing, Michigan, and it is not a simple one. He never finished high school. That is where the story of Billy Durant begins. Not in a boardroom, not in a factory, but in a small city in Michigan where a teenage boy with no degree and no inheritance decided that none of it mattered. His father had walked out when Billy was 7 years old, left for a fishing trip one morning and never came back. His mother became everything: his anchor, his audience, his reason. At the height of his power, Durant would cancel meetings with bankers and board members to spend a few hours with her. The men who worked for him called it his most striking quality, not his salesmanship, not his vision, his devotion to the woman who stayed. He started selling cigars. Then he read gas meters. Then he sold insurance and real estate. None of it was the thing, but all of it was training. Billy Durant was learning how to read people, how to close a room, how to make a stranger feel that buying whatever he was selling was the smartest decision they would ever make. In 1886, he caught a ride in a friend's two-wheeled road cart. The suspension was different, smooth over rough ground, light under pressure. Most men would have enjoyed the ride and forgotten it. Durant stepped off that cart and immediately bought a train ticket, 75 miles to the factory. That same afternoon, he purchased the rights to the design for $1,500. Money he did not have. That was how Billy Durant operated. He saw something, he moved, and he figured out the rest later. The Durant Dort Carriage Company became one of the largest carriage manufacturers in the world. By the turn of the century, it was pulling in $2 million a year. Most men would have stopped there. Durant was already looking at something else. Automobiles. Dirty, dangerous, unreliable. He had said all of that himself, but the numbers told a different story. He saw the future before the future had arrived. In 1904, he took over Buick Motor Company, a firm with enormous potential and almost no money. He entered a single Buick in the New York Auto Show and came home with orders for 1,100 cars. At the time, only 37 Buicks had ever been built. 4 years later, Buick was the best-selling automobile in America, and Billy Durant was just getting started. What he did next had never been done before. Rather than build one company around one car, he imagined something entirely different. A constellation of brands, each targeting a different buyer, all orbiting a single center of gravity. Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland. He did not invent cars, he invented the modern automobile corporation. On September 16, 1908, General Motors was born. He was 46 years old. He had built 2 empires. And the bankers, the men with the money, the men who had watched him do all of this, were already sharpening their knives. The first time they came for him, it was 1910. General Motors had grown faster than any company in American history. And that was exactly the problem. 21 car models, dozens of divisions, acquisitions that looked like genius in good times and looked like madness when the market turned. When sales dried up and cash ran out, the banks moved in. They offered Durant a choice: accept our terms or watch everything collapse. He accepted. Starting September 26, 1910, a banker named James Storrow took control of General Motors. Durant was out. The company he had built from nothing, gone, handed to men in suits who had never sold a single car in their lives. Most people would have disappeared. Durant walked out of the GM building and started over. He partnered with a Buick race car driver named Louis Chevrolet. The car they built together, the Chevrolet 490, priced within $50 of Ford's Model T, but with an electric starter, electric lights, and a spare tire, became a sensation. Durant sold Chevrolet stock hand over fist, then used those shares to buy back General Motors from the inside, quietly, methodically, share by share. In 1916, he walked into the General Motors annual shareholder meeting, followed by a line of assistants, each carrying a basket filled with stock certificates. He looked at the board and announced calmly, "Gentlemen, I now control this company." It was by any measure one of the most audacious comebacks in the history of American business. For the next 4 years, Durant led GM to heights no one had imagined. He added Chevrolet to the family. He brought in Fisher Body. He founded Frigidaire. Under his leadership, GM grew 8 times larger than the company the bankers had been managing. Then 1920 arrived. The post-war boom collapsed. Stocks lost a quarter of their value. 100,000 businesses failed across the country. GM shares fell from $42 in March to $14 in October. Durant felt personally responsible for every shareholder who had trusted him, friends, neighbors, people who had believed in him when no one else would. He began secretly buying GM stock on margin, trying to hold the price, trying to protect them. 6 months later, his $90 million was gone. The DuPont family, watching their own investment disappear, moved to force him out. On November 30th, 1920, William Crapo Durant resigned as president of General Motors for the second time. Alfred Sloan, who would go on to run GM for the next 3 decades, was in the room. He remembered it this way. You knew he was grief-stricken, but no grief showed in his face. He was smiling pleasantly, as if it were a routine matter. Durant was 59 years old, unemployed, nearly broke. The following morning, he began building Durant Motors. He did not wait. That was the thing about Billy Durant that his enemies never understood and his admirers never forgot. Other men took time to grieve, to plan, to recover. Durant moved. The morning after he lost General Motors for the second time, he was already making calls. Within weeks, he had raised $5 million from banking contacts in New York. Not because they believed in the plan barely existed yet. They believed in him, in the track record, in the name. Billy Durant had built 2 of the most valuable companies in America from nothing. The men with money decided that was enough to bet on a third time. Durant Motors Incorporated was formally established on January 12, 1921. The first prototype, the Model A22, a clean 4-cylinder design built around a simple premise, give working Americans a real car at a real price, was ready by March. Durant took it to New York City. On August 4, 1921, the car went on public display. Within days, 30,000 orders had been placed, $31 million in commitments from people who had seen the car once. Henry Ford had taken years to reach numbers like that. Durant did it in a week. The Lansing factory on Verlinden Avenue had already been under construction since 1920. Durant had begun building before the company was even incorporated, because waiting for paperwork was not something Billy Durant did. The man who managed the plant was Edward Verlinden, a former Oldsmobile executive who knew Lansing's automotive workforce better than anyone. The location was not accidental. Lansing was a city that already knew how to build cars. The workers were there. The infrastructure was there. And Durant knew the ground. By February 1922, the Star Motor Company was established as a dedicated division, a separate brand aimed directly at the buyer who might otherwise walk into a Ford dealership. The Star was not a cheap car pretending to be more. It was a genuine competitor. Similar price, more refinement, more options. Ford noticed immediately. Henry Ford cut the price of the Model T by $50. That was the clearest possible signal that Durant had built something real. By the summer of 1923, less than 2 years after the company's founding, Durant Motors had 50,000 employees spread across 10 factories, with 4,000 dealers operating across the United States. The brands multiplied: Durant for the middle market, Star for the entry buyer, Flint for those who wanted something closer to Buick, and Locomobile at the luxury end. Acquired at Liquidation in 1922 to compete with Rolls-Royce and Pierce Arrow. It was General Motors, rebuilt from memory. And for one brief, extraordinary period, it worked. The scale of what Durant had accomplished in 24 months was, by any honest measure, staggering. 5 manufacturing plants, Lansing, Flint, Elizabeth, Oakland, and Leaside in Ontario. A dealer network that stretched from Michigan to California to Canada. A product lineup designed to capture every buyer at every price point. The architecture was identical to what he had built at General Motors. Because it had worked at General Motors, and Durant saw no reason to reinvent what he already knew. What he had built at GM took years. What he rebuilt with Durant Motors took months. The men on Wall Street who had watched him do it the first time were now watching him do it again, and they were impressed. Durant's reputation, already enormous, grew larger. His name moved markets. When he spoke publicly about the automobile industry, newspapers printed it on the front page. When he hinted at expansion, investors called his office. And on Verlinden Avenue in Lansing, the factory ran. 3 shifts. The line moving. Stars and Durants taking shape from steel and rubber and glass. Workers who had spent years at Oldsmobile, or REO, now clocking in under a new name. But the same rhythms, the same hands, the same pride in watching something come together from nothing. The city felt it. By the mid-1920s, Lansing's automotive workforce had grown past 13,000. The bars and diners near the plant stayed busy. Families bought homes. Children went to school on wages earned at Verlinden Avenue. This was what a factory meant to a city. Not just production, but possibility. In 1926, Star sales climbed 69% from the previous year. The numbers were real. The momentum was real. But beneath the momentum, something was already wrong. Durant Motors was not General Motors. It did not have GM's capital reserves, GM's supplier relationships, or GM's ability to absorb a bad year without bleeding. Every dollar Durant Motors earned went back into the machine, paying workers, funding dealers, servicing debt. There was no cushion. There was no room for error. Durant knew this. He had always known it. His answer, the answer it had always been, was to move faster than the problems could catch him. For a while it worked. Then the problems stopped being the kind you could outrun. The market began to shift in ways that Durant had not built for. Buyers who might have chosen a Star in 1924 were walking into Chevrolet dealerships by 1927 because GM had resources Durant did not, and GM was using them. Ford was fighting back. The middle of the market where Durant had planted his flag was becoming the most contested ground in American industry. And Billy Durant, as he always did when the walls began to close in, turned to Wall Street. That decision would cost him everything. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built. Not the company, not the balance sheets, the place. Verlinden Avenue ran along the western edge of Lansing, a straight line through a working neighborhood where the houses were modest and the yards were small, and the men who lived there did not talk about the stock market. They talked about the line, which shift they were on, whether the foreman was reasonable, whether the overtime was worth it. These were people who measured their lives in cars built, not dollars traded. The Durant plant sat at the center of that world. It was not the biggest factory in Michigan. It was not the most modern, but it was alive in the way that only a factory running at full capacity can be. The noise of it, the heat of it, the smell of metal and oil and paint that settled into the clothes of everyone who worked there and never quite left. Workers who spent decades on that line would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Not as a burden, as a mark. The first manager of the Verlinden plant was Edward Verlinden, a former Oldsmobile executive whose family name was already woven into the street itself. He understood Lansing's workforce in ways that a corporate appointment from Detroit never could. These were skilled men, experienced men, men who had helped build the early American automobile industry with their hands. Durant had chosen well. By the mid-1920s, Lansing's total automotive workforce had surpassed 13,000. Oldsmobile was there, REO was there, and now Durant was there. Another flag planted in a city that had decided quietly and without ceremony that it was going to be an automobile town for as long as automobiles mattered. The Star came off the Verlinden line and went to buyers who wanted what Ford offered, but expected something more. It was a modest car. No one confused it with a Packard, but it was honest. It did what it promised. And in 1922, that was enough to make Henry Ford nervous. Ford's response was swift and direct. Cut the Model T price by $50. It was the automotive equivalent of a heavyweight throwing a jab to check the range. He had noticed. He was answering. That mattered. It meant the star was real. For the workers on Verlinden Avenue, the competition between Durant and Ford was not an abstraction. It was job security. Every star that sold was another shift, another paycheck, another month of mortgage payments made. They followed the sales numbers the way other men followed baseball scores. In 1926, the star's best year, those numbers looked very good. The line kept moving. The city kept breathing. 40 steps from the factory gate, Harry Andros opened his bar. He was a Greek immigrant who had come to Lansing with nothing and built something small and permanent, a place called Harry's Place at 404 North Verlinden Avenue, established in 1921 in the same year the factory opened. The timing was not a coincidence. Harry understood something fundamental. Wherever men work hard, they need somewhere to go when the whistle blows. Harry's Place was that somewhere. In the early years, it was common to stop in before a shift, between shifts, after shifts. The bar served the rhythms of the factory the way a church serves a neighborhood. As the place where people gathered to be with each other, to process the day, to sit with the particular exhaustion that comes from physical work done well. The men who drank at Harry's Place built the cars that Durant shipped to dealers across the country. They were not abstractions in an annual report. They were the thing itself. The neighborhood around Verlinden Avenue grew with the factory. Homes filled in, small businesses followed the workers, a grocery here, a barbershop there. The texture of a working-class community taking shape around a shared purpose. Because that is what a factory does when it runs. It does not just make products, it makes a place. Billy Durant understood this in his way. In 1921, the same year the factory opened, the same year Harry's Place opened, Durant donated a parcel of land to the city of Lansing. Durant Park at 700 North Washington Avenue was his gift to the Northside residents, a green space in a working neighborhood, a gesture that said, I am not just taking from the city, I am leaving something behind. It was a rare moment of stillness from a man who was almost never still. What did it feel like to work on Verlinden Avenue in the mid-1920s? It felt like the future was being decided right there, on that line, by those hands. The American automobile industry was the most dynamic economic force on the planet, and Lansing was inside it, not watching from the outside, inside. The workers on the Durant line were building more than cars. They were building the argument that Billy Durant's third act was going to work, that the man who had been thrown out of his own company twice was going to prove, on Verlinden Avenue, that he had been right all along. For a few years, the argument held. The line moved, the cars shipped. Harry's Place stayed open late. And somewhere in New York, Billy Durant was making bets that none of them knew about. Bets that would eventually reach all the way back to Lansing and pull the whole thing down. The cracks did not appear all at once. That is the hardest thing to understand about the collapse of Durant Motors. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no one decision, no one villain, no single morning when everything changed. It happened the way most industrial collapses happen, slowly then suddenly. A series of small structural weaknesses, each manageable on its own, each ignored in turn, until the weight of all of them together became impossible to carry. The first weakness was the one Durant had never been able to fix in himself. He built fast. He always built fast. It was his genius and his flaw in equal measure. At General Motors, he had assembled an empire of brands and suppliers and factories in the time it took other men to write a business plan. The speed worked when markets were expanding. It became a liability the moment they stopped. Durant Motors had been constructed on the same template: rapid expansion, thin capital reserves, a structure that depended on continuous sales growth to service its debt. There was no cushion. At General Motors, the DuPont family's capital and Alfred Sloan's financial discipline had eventually provided that cushion after Durant was gone. Durant Motors had neither. What it had was Durant's name, Durant's energy, and a market that was beginning to ask harder questions than Durant's energy could answer. The second weakness was the competition, and it was coming from every direction. Ford had not gone away. The Model T, older now, showing its age, was still selling by the millions, and Ford was preparing something new. Chevrolet, now firmly inside General Motors and operating with GM's full resources behind it, was targeting exactly the same buyer as the star. The working American who wanted more than Ford, but could not afford Buick. Durant was fighting his old company with a fraction of his old company's budget, and GM was fighting back with everything it had. By the mid-1920s, Chevrolet had surpassed the star in sales. The gap between what GM could spend on development, advertising, and dealer support and what Durant Motors could spend was not closing. It was widening. Every year, the ground beneath Durant's feet shifted a little further. The third weakness was the product line itself. Durant had built too many brands too quickly. Star, Durant, Flint, Locomobile, Rugby, each required its own engineering, its own dealer network, its own marketing. The logic had worked at GM because GM had the scale to support it. Durant Motors did not. Resources that should have been concentrated were spread thin. Models that needed development didn't get it. Dealers who needed support didn't always receive it. The Princeton, a planned luxury model aimed at Packard buyers, was announced, prototyped, displayed at the New York Auto Show, and never produced. The Eagle brand was announced and never built at all. These were not failures of vision. They were failures of capacity. Durant could see exactly where he wanted to go. He simply did not have enough to get there. By 1927, the Star line was discontinued. The Durant brand absorbed what remained. The product lineup, once designed to cover every price point from Ford to Rolls-Royce, was contracting. Factories that had been running 3 shifts were running 2. Dealers who had signed on in the optimism of 1922 were quietly exploring other options. The momentum that had carried Durant Motors through its first years was fading, and Billy Durant, watching the numbers with the particular clarity that successful gamblers develop, knowing what they mean, unable to stop, made the decision that would end everything. He turned to Wall Street. Not as a last resort, as a strategy. Durant had always believed that capital markets were another tool, another lever to pull. In the late 1920s, the American stock market was the most intoxicating environment in the history of finance. Prices rising, fortunes multiplying, the entire country convinced that prosperity was permanent. Durant moved into that environment the way he moved into everything, all in. By 1928, he had an estimated $1 billion in the market, accounts with at least 15 brokers, commission fees rumored at $6 million a year. He led a consortium of investors, his so-called prosperity boys, who between them controlled an almost incomprehensible volume of American stocks. Durant Motors was no longer his primary focus. Wall Street was. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The number that defined that day was not one number. It was millions of numbers, all moving in the same direction at the same time. Downward, faster than the ticker tape could record them. Fortunes that had taken decades to build disappeared in hours. Banks failed. Brokers called in their margins. Men who had been wealthy on Monday were bankrupt by Friday. Billy Durant saw it coming. That is the cruelest part of the story. He was not naive. He was not ignorant of the risks. He had watched markets his entire life, had ridden them up and down, had survived crashes that destroyed lesser men. When the selling began in October 1929, Durant did not panic. He organized. He assembled a consortium, himself, members of the Rockefeller family, other financial giants, and they began buying. Deliberately, publicly, with the specific intention of demonstrating confidence in the market. If enough powerful men bought aggressively, the logic went, the panic would stop. The market would stabilize. Confidence would return. The market did not stabilize. Durant bought anyway. More than anyone, he felt personally responsible for the shareholders who had followed his lead, for the friends and neighbors who had trusted his judgment, for the working people who had put their savings into the stocks he had recommended. He could not walk away from that. It was not in him to walk away. By the time he stopped, His personal losses were catastrophic. $90 million gone. The network of brokers, the accounts, the positions, all of it unwinding in real time. And Durant Motors, which had been struggling before the crash, now faced a market that had simply stopped buying cars. What happens to a factory when the economy collapses? The answer on Verlinden Avenue was the same as everywhere else. Orders slowed, then stopped. The 3 shifts became 2, then 1. Workers were let go in groups, first dozens, then hundreds. The men who walked off the line for the last time did not make speeches. They collected their final pay, said goodbye to the men they had worked beside for years, and walked out through the gate on Verlinden Avenue into a city that was suddenly desperately short of options. Harry's place got quieter, then quieter still. Durant tried to save the company the way he had saved everything else, by moving faster, by restructuring, by finding new angles. He negotiated to produce the Mathis, a small French automobile, at the Lansing plant. The deal was announced. It generated interest. It went nowhere. The Depression had made caution the only currency that mattered, and caution was the one thing Billy Durant had never been able to spend. By 1931, Durant Motors was finished, not with a crash, not with a scandal, with silence, the particular silence of a company that has simply run out of road. Dealers stopped ordering, suppliers stopped delivering. The workers still on the line could feel it in the rhythm of the factory itself, in the gaps between tasks, in the machinery that ran slower, in the foreman who stopped talking about next month's production numbers. In the summer of 1931, the last Durant-branded automobiles rolled off the assembly line in Lansing. No ceremony, no speeches, no final photograph of the workers gathered around the last car. Just the line stopping, the machines going quiet, and the gates on Verlinden Avenue closing on a company that had, for one extraordinary decade, made Henry Ford cut his prices and made the world believe that Billy Durant was going to do the impossible a third time. The company went into receivership in 1932. Full liquidation followed in 1933. Durant Park still stood at 700 North Washington Avenue, the name on the gate unchanged. The factory at Verlinden Avenue stood empty, and the man who had built all of it was somewhere in New York, trying to figure out what came next. He always believed something came next. This time he was wrong. What does a man do when everything he built's gone? For most men, that question has no good answer. The loss of a company, especially one built twice from nothing, especially one that carried your name on the door, is the kind of thing that ends careers, breaks health, empties the years that remain into something gray and purposeless. History is full of men who did not survive that kind of loss. Not physically, spiritually. They became shadows of what they had been, and the shadows grew smaller until there was nothing left. Billy Durant was not most men, but he was not invincible either. The years between 1931 and 1936 were the years of the slow reckoning. The period when the distance between who Durant had been and who he now was became impossible to ignore. The money was gone. The company was gone. The factories were gone. What remained was the name, the reputation, and a man in his 70s who still believed, with a ferocity that bordered on delusion, that the next idea was the one that would work. He tried to save Durant Motors through the final months of its existence with a kind of frantic improvisation that had served him well in better times. He announced new models. He pursued new partnerships. He negotiated the Mathis deal, a French compact car that might have given the Lansing factory a second life, and watched it collapse under the weight of a depression that had made Americans too frightened to buy anything they did not absolutely need. Nothing worked. In 1932, Durant Motors entered receivership. In 1933, it was formally liquidated. The assets, the machinery, the tooling, the inventory, whatever remained on the factory floors, were sold off to pay creditors. The brands that Durant had spent a decade building disappeared into the bankruptcy proceedings with barely a notice in the financial press. The Verlinden Avenue plant stood silent. 4 years it sat there, through Michigan winters that turned the windows white and Michigan summers that filled the lot with weeds. The factory that had employed thousands, that had run 3 shifts around the clock, that had made Henry Ford reduce his prices, was now just a building, a large, cold, empty building on a street that had once smelled of metal and oil and now smelled of nothing at all. Harry's place stayed open. Harry Andrus kept the lights on and the coffee hot because that was what he did, and because some of the men still came. Not the factory workers, not anymore, but the neighborhood men, the older ones, the ones who sat at the counter and remembered what Verlinen Avenue had sounded like when the line was running. Memory in a place like that is its own kind of loyalty. Durant, meanwhile, had moved to New York, not by choice, by necessity. The elegant home at Deal, New Jersey, the one with the furnishings and the grounds, had been sold at auction in 1938 for a fraction of what it had cost. The apartments in New York and Flint remained, kept through arrangements that Durant himself could not have sustained without help. And then came 1936. On a Tuesday in January, William Crapo Durant, founder of General Motors, founder of Chevrolet, founder of Durant Motors, the man who had once controlled $4 billion in Wall Street investments, walked into a federal bankruptcy court and filed his papers. Debts, $914,000. Assets, $250. The court clerk recorded it without comment. These were just numbers, but they were numbers that told the complete story of a life lived at maximum velocity in every direction. The greatness and the recklessness, the vision and the blindness, all of it reduced to a single line in a bankruptcy filing. Shortly after the proceedings, a group of reporters received an anonymous tip. They followed it to Asbury Park, New Jersey, to a 5-cent hamburger joint attached to a supermarket. The supermarket had been opened in a building that everyone in the neighborhood recognized. It was Durant's former showroom, the place where his salesman had once stood beside gleaming automobiles and spoken of the future. Behind the counter, wearing an apron, washing dishes, was Billy Durant. He looked up when the reporters came in. He did not appear embarrassed. He did not appear broken. He smiled the same way Alfred Sloan had described him smiling on the day he resigned from GM. Pleasantly, as if this were simply the next thing, and the next thing after that would be something better. That smile was either the mark of a man with extraordinary resilience, or the mark of a man who had never fully accepted that the game was over. Probably both. He was 74 years old and he was not finished. That is the thing that makes Billy Durant impossible to dismiss, even at the lowest point of his story. Another man, at 74, after 2 corporate collapses, after a personal bankruptcy that left him with $250, after watching the company that bore his name dissolve into nothing, another man would have found a quiet room somewhere and stayed in it. Durant started planning. He had read the American consumer correctly his entire life. He had seen the automobile before most people believed it was real. He had seen the mass market before Ford had finished building it. And now in the late 1930s, he saw something else. The American family needed somewhere to go. The Depression had made entertainment a luxury, but the Depression was ending. And when it ended, people would want to do things together. Wholesome things, affordable things, things that did not require wealth to enjoy. Bowling. Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, the man who had once controlled $1 billion in Wall Street investments, decided that bowling alleys were the future of American leisure. Not one bowling alley, a chain, 50 locations across the country, family-friendly, clean, accessible. The kind of place a factory worker could bring his wife and children on a Saturday afternoon and feel that life was good. The idea was not as absurd as it sounds. Durant was, in this as in everything, ahead of his time. The post-war bowling boom that would sweep America in the 1950s, filling suburbs with lanes, making bowling one of the most popular recreational activities in the country, proved him right. He just arrived at the conclusion a decade too early, with too little capital and too little time. In 1940, he opened the North Flint Recreation Center, a bowling alley and fast food restaurant in Flint, Michigan. He chose the location with characteristic defiance. It sat in the shadow of Buick City, the enormous General Motors plant he had built 3 decades earlier. Every morning he drove past the building that his vision had created, that now operated under someone else's name, and he went to work in his bowling alley. He worked the kitchen himself. That detail, reported by those who visited at the time, is the one that stays. Not because it is sad, though it is, because it reveals something essential about the man. Billy Durant had never been too proud to do the work. He had read gas meters. He had sold cigars. He had washed dishes in Asbury Park. Now he was running a kitchen in Flint. The scale had changed. The disposition had not. He believed the chain would grow. He had plans, drawings, projections, the full apparatus of a Durant enterprise, miniaturized to fit the resources available. 50 bowling alleys, a national brand, something that would matter. Then, in 1942, he had a stroke. He was 80 years old. The stroke did not kill him. Durant was not the kind of man who went easily. But it ended the bowling alley plans, ended the kitchen work, ended the last entrepreneurial chapter of a life that had been nothing but entrepreneurial chapters. He spent his final years as an invalid, sustained by a pension of $10,000 a year, arranged by Alfred Sloan on behalf of General Motors. The company Durant had founded, the company that had fired him twice, now quietly paying his bills in the years he could no longer pay them himself. Walter Chrysler helped too, and others from the industry he had built. The men who had replaced him, who had profited from the structures he created, who ran the empires his imagination had assembled. They made sure he did not die in poverty. It was the least they could do. It was also, in its way, an acknowledgement of what the record books had failed to capture. On March 18, 1947, at 2:15 in the morning, William Crapo Durant died in his apartment in New York City. His wife, Catherine, was beside him. A nurse was there. Outside the window, the city he had never quite belonged to continued its indifferent noise. He was 85 years old. Henry Ford died 11 weeks later. Wealthy, famous, and despised by many who had worked for him. The newspapers ran Ford's obituary on the front page for days. Durant's death received respectful notices. Brief ones. The man who built General Motors was already being confused, in some quarters, with Will Durant, the philosopher, a different man entirely. Back in Lansing, on Verlinden Avenue, the factory that bore his earliest ambitions was running under a different name, making cars for a company that had once fired him. The line was moving. The machines were loud. Nobody mentioned Billy Durant's name. The factory did not mourn. That is not a criticism. That is simply what factories do, or do not do. They run or they sit. They produce or they wait. The Verlinden Avenue plant had sat for 4 years after Durant Motors collapsed, through the worst of the Depression, through the slow grinding poverty that had settled over Lansing like a second winter that refused to end. The machinery gathered dust. The loading docks stood empty. The neighborhood around it grew quieter in the particular way that neighborhoods grow quiet when the anchor is gone. Not abandoned, not destroyed, just diminished. Waiting. In 1935, General Motors came. The purchase was straightforward. A distressed asset acquired at Depression-era prices, folded into the Fisher Body division, which needed production capacity, and recognized in the Verlinden plant a facility that, despite 4 years of dormancy, had good bones. The machinery was serviceable. The location was sound. The workforce was there, in the surrounding neighborhood, waiting to be called back. When the gates reopened, the men came. Some of them had worked the Durant line. Some were younger. Sons of Durant workers, men who had grown up hearing about Verlinden Avenue from their fathers, and now had the chance to walk through the same gate. The rhythms were familiar even to those who had never been inside. The shift schedules, the line discipline, the particular culture of a Michigan automotive plant, these things did not change with the name above the door. Harry's place noticed immediately. Matt Bates, whose family would run the bar for generations, remembered what the older regulars described. The morning the Fisher Body workers started coming in, 3 and 4 and 5 times a day, filling the stools in the booths with the noise and the appetite of men doing physical work again. The Depression had not ended, but on Verlinden Avenue something had restarted, something that felt, if not like prosperity, then at least like the possibility of it. The Fisher Body division ran the plant through the late 1930s, then through the war years, when the line converted to military production, when the women came to fill the shifts that the men had left for Europe and the Pacific, when Lansing's factories became part of what the country would later call the arsenal of democracy. After the war, the plant returned to cars, and the cars it returned to were Oldsmobiles. the same brand that Durant had acquired for General Motors in 1908. The same brand whose original factory sat just across town on the Grand River. The circle was not lost on anyone who was paying attention, though in 1945, most people were not paying attention to circles. They were paying attention to getting back to work. The decades that followed were the decades of Oldsmobile. From the 1940s through the 1980s, the Verlinen plant, now operating as part of the larger Lansing car assembly complex, its bodybuilding operations connected by truck convoy to the main chassis plant downtown on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, produced full-size Oldsmobiles in volumes that would have astonished the men who built the original Durant Star on that same ground. The Oldsmobile 88, the Oldsmobile 98, cars that defined what the American middle class drove, not the cheapest option, not the most expensive, but the solid center of the market where ambition and affordability met. These were the cars that sat in the driveways of the homes that the workers built with the wages they earned on Verlinen Avenue. The factory made the cars. The wages bought the houses filled the neighborhoods surrounded the factory. It was a closed loop, and for 30 years it held. The plant grew with the decades. New equipment, new models, new generations of workers following their fathers and their fathers' fathers through the same gate on Verlinen Avenue. By the time the Buick Oldsmobile Cadillac era arrived in the 1980s, GM's attempt to rationalize its brand architecture, the Lansing complex had been producing automobiles continuously for more than 80 years. That was a record. Quietly, without ceremony, Lansing Car Assembly had become the longest continuously operating automobile factory in the United States. The plant Billy Durant had built in 1920 on borrowed money ahead of the company that would use it in a city he trusted because he knew its people, was still running. Older now, more complex, carrying the weight of 100,000 decisions made by men Durant had never met, but running. In 2002, the Harbor Report, the automotive industry's definitive annual measurement of plant efficiency, ranked Lansing Car Assembly as the #1 most productive assembly plant in all of North America. #1, not in Michigan, not in the Midwest, the continent. The factory that Durant had thrown up in 12 months on Verlinen Avenue, the factory that had sat empty for 4 years during the Depression, the factory that GM had bought for pennies on the dollar in 1935, was, 70 years later, the most efficient automobile plant on the continent. Billy Durant would have loved that number. He would have used it in a sales pitch before the ink was dry. But 2002 was not the end of the story. It was, in retrospect, the last good year. The ground was shifting again, and this time, there was no one left to outrun it. The announcement came on a Tuesday in March. General Motors Corporation, the company Billy Durant had founded, the company that had fired him twice, the company that had bought his factory for Depression-era prices and run it for 70 years, issued a press release stating that Lansing Car Assembly would close in May 2005. The reason was straightforward and delivered without sentiment. The Pontiac Grand Am and the Chevrolet Classic, the two models still being produced at the plant, were being discontinued. No models, no production, no plant. Nearly 3,000 hourly workers would be laid off. 250 salaried employees would be transferred to other locations. The closure would be complete by late spring. A spokesman named Stefan Weinmann handled the press questions. He was professional and accurate and said nothing that was not true. The plant was old. The system of building car bodies on Verlinen Avenue and trucking them across town to the chassis plant cost millions of dollars annually. An inefficiency that newer facilities had been designed to eliminate. 2 new plants were already operational or under construction in the Lansing area. The work would continue, just not here. The logic was sound. The logic was also the end of 85 years. For the workers who received the news on that Tuesday in March, the logic was not the first thing they felt. What they felt first was the particular vertigo of a future that had seemed settled suddenly becoming unsettled. The sensation of a floor dropping away that you had assumed was permanent. Many of them had spent decades on that line. Some had followed their fathers in. Some had been planning to retire from there. The plant was not just employment, it was the architecture of their lives. U.S. Representative Mike Rogers, whose district included the Lansing area, called the closure a major blow. He spoke of ripple effects, the suppliers, the service businesses, the entire economic ecosystem that a plant of that size sustains without anyone fully accounting for it until it is gone. The hamburger joints, the hardware stores, the bars. Harry's Place still open at 404 North Verlinden Avenue, still serving the men who came in before and after shifts, soon to face the same silence it had faced in 1931, when Durant's line had stopped and the neighborhood had held its breath waiting for something to replace it. This time, nothing was coming to replace it. The new plants were built for different work. Flexible production lines for SUVs and crossovers, the vehicles that American buyers were choosing in the early 2000s in numbers that the industry had not anticipated. The Pontiac Grand Am, which the Lansing plant had been building since 1985, belonged to a category of car that was losing ground every model year. Buyers were moving. The market was moving. And a plant built in 1920 to make Durant stars was not going to move with it. What no press release mentioned, what the financial logic could not quite contain, was the weight of what was ending. 104 years. That was how long automotive manufacturing had been continuous on that ground. Not at the Verlinden plant specifically. The downtown chassis plant on the Grand River was the original Oldsmobile Works site, opened in 1901. But the two plants had been operating together as Lansing Car Assembly for decades, and together they represented an unbroken chain of production stretching back to the earliest years of the American automobile. Through two world wars, through the Depression, through the oil crises of the 1970s, the Japanese competition of the 1980s, the platform wars of the 1990s. Through all of it, the line had kept moving. Now it was stopping. James Walkinshaw had worked as an engineer at GM from 1953 to 1986. He had spent his career inside those buildings, had engineered many of them, had written a book about Oldsmobile history, had devoted decades to understanding what the plant meant to the city and what the city meant to the plant. When asked about the closure, he did not reach for corporate language or economic analysis. He said, "It's like watching a friend die." The last Oldsmobile had already left. That moment, the true emotional end of the Lansing Car Assembly story, the death of the oldest American automobile brand, had come a full year before the plant's closing date, on April 29, 2004. The car was an Alero sedan, dark metallic cherry red, one of the final 500 ever manufactured, each of them carrying a small emblem on the body that read simply, Final 500. The workers on the line that day knew what they were building. They had known for months. GM had announced the discontinuation of Oldsmobile in 2000, a decision that had sent a particular kind of grief through Lansing, a city whose identity had been bound to that brand for more than a century. When the Alero reached the end of the line, the workers did something that assembly line workers almost never do. They stopped. They gathered around the car. One by one, they signed it, their names in marker on the body of the last Oldsmobile that would ever be built. Then George Nahas, president of the Oldsmobile Dealer Council, rode with GM employees as the car was driven slowly off the line for the final time. It went to the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in downtown Lansing, where it went on display. America's oldest automobile brand, 106 years old, was over. The plant kept running. The Pontiac Grand Am, the Chevrolet Classic, models that did not carry the same weight of history, but kept the line moving and the workers employed for one more year. It was, in retrospect, borrowed time. Everyone on the floor knew it. The new plants were coming. The old logic was ending. May 6, 2005 arrived the way endings always arrive, both suddenly and not at all surprisingly. Doug Buxton had worked the main assembly line from 1964 to 2003. He had given nearly 4 decades to the plant, had watched it change, had watched colleagues retire and be replaced by their children, had absorbed the particular culture of a place where the work was hard and the relationships were harder to replace. When he talked about what the plant had meant to him, he did not talk about the cars. He talked about the people. "It's like being in the Army," he said. "You remember a lot of them after you go." On May 6, the final Pontiac Grand Am rolled off the line. The workers who were there described it the way people describe the last moments of something they know they will never see again. With the heightened attention that loss produces, the awareness of detail that ordinary days do not demand, the sound of the line, the smell of the floor, the faces of the men and women standing around the last car, not quite sure what to do with their hands. Then the line stopped. The machines went quiet on Verlinden Avenue for the second time in the building's history. The first time had been 1931, when Durant's company had run out of road, and the silence had lasted 4 years before GM came to fill it. This time, the silence would be permanent. In the spring of 2006, the demolition crews arrived. They worked through 2006 and into 2007, taking down what Durant had built in 1920 and what GM had expanded across 8 decades. Brick by brick, beam by beam, until the corner of Verlinden Avenue, where the factory had stood, was open ground. The site was turned over to the Racer Trust for environmental remediation. The land that had produced millions of automobiles, that had employed generations of Lansing families, that had outlasted 2 world wars and 1 Great Depression, was being cleaned of the chemicals it had absorbed over 85 years of continuous production. Harry's place was still open. 404 North Verlinden Avenue, the bar that Harry Andros had opened in 1921 to serve the Durant workers, that had served the Fisher Body workers and the Oldsmobile workers and the Grand Am workers for 84 years. Matt Bates, who had grown up in the place, remembered the day the last workers stopped coming in. 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, we had all GM boys coming in, he said. Then we had nothing. My mom didn't want it to be done yet. The factory was gone. The street remained. Verlinden Avenue, quiet now. The way it had been quiet in 1931, the way it had never quite been quiet in the 70 years between. What remains of Billy Durant in Lansing is easy to miss. Durant Park sits at 700 North Washington Avenue, a modest green space near Lansing Community College, marked by a stone archway that carries his name. Most people who walk past it do not know who he was. Most people who know the name General Motors do not know the name Durant. That is the particular cruelty of his legacy. He built the container, and history filled it with other men's names. The Verlinden Avenue site is being remediated by the Racer Trust. Environmental cleanup of a former industrial property. The unglamorous final chapter of a place that once ran 3 shifts around the clock. The chemicals that 85 years of automobile production left in the soil are being removed, slowly, at considerable expense, by an organization most Lansing residents have never heard of. Where the factory stood, there is open ground. Where the loading docks were, there is nothing. The address still exists. The building does not. Harry's place still stands at 404 North Verlinden Avenue. That matters more than it might seem. In a neighborhood that lost its anchor when the factory closed, a bar that has been open since 1921 is not just a bar. It is memory made physical. The one place on Verlinden Avenue where the connection between what was and what is has not been severed. The men who drink there now are not the Durant workers or the Fisher Body workers or the Grand Am workers. But the walls remember. The regulars know the history. And Harry Andrews' decision in 1921 to open a bar 40 steps from a factory gate turns out to have been the most durable investment anyone made on that street. The factory is gone. The bar remains. There is a lesson in that, though it is not a comfortable one. What does it mean that the longest operating automobile factory in the United States, a plant that survived the Depression, 2 world wars, the oil crisis, and the Japanese competition, was ultimately closed not by any external force, but by a spreadsheet? By the calculation that trucking car bodies across town cost too much per unit, that the models being produced were no longer what buyers wanted, that newer plants built for different vehicles made more financial sense. It means that efficiency and longevity are not the same thing. It means that being the best at what you do is not protection against becoming obsolete at what you do. Lansing Car Assembly was ranked the most productive plant in North America in 2002. 3 years later, it was rubble. Durant had learned that lesson first. The plant learned it last. The pattern that destroyed Durant Motors is not difficult to recognize. Build fast, expand faster. Depend on continuous growth to service the debt that growth requires. Treat capital markets as a tool rather than a risk. Believe genuinely, not foolishly, but genuinely, that the next bet is the one that changes everything. It is a pattern that has ended more American companies than foreign competition ever has. It ended Durant Motors in 1931. It has ended companies in every decade since. What makes Durant's story different from a simple cautionary tale is that the pattern also built General Motors. The same instincts that destroyed Durant Motors, the speed, the appetite, the refusal to accept limits, were the instincts that assembled Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Chevrolet, and Fisher Body into a single corporation in the space of a few years. The genius and the flaw were not separate things. They were the same thing, expressed in different market conditions. In an expanding market, Billy Durant's instincts were visionary. In a contracting one, they were fatal. That is not a paradox unique to Durant. It is the central paradox of American industrial ambition. The quality that builds the empire is the quality that cannot survive the empire's maturity. Durant could not become Alfred Sloan. He was not built for consolidation, for caution, for the patient management of what already existed. He was built for creation, and creation eventually runs out of room. The workers on Verlinden Avenue did not share Durant's flaw. They were not gamblers. They were not speculators. They showed up, they did the work, they built the cars, they earned the wages, they raised the families. They did everything right, and they lost their factory anyway. First in 1931 because the man who built it could not stop betting, and again in 2005 because the company that replaced him decided their plant no longer fit the plan. That is the part of the story that does not resolve neatly. The workers are not a cautionary tale. They are the people the cautionary tale happened to. Billy Durant is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. The grave is modest. The name on the stone is the same name on the park in Lansing. The same name that does not appear on any car that anyone has ever driven, because the cars Durant built were absorbed into brands that outlived him, and the company that bore his name did not. General Motors is still in Lansing. Two plants, the Grand River Assembly and the Delta Township Assembly, employ thousands of workers today, building SUVs and crossovers for a market that Durant would have understood immediately and pursued without hesitation. On Verlinden Avenue, the ground is clean now, or being cleaned. The Racer Trust is still working. Harry's Place is still open. And somewhere under the remediated soil of a former factory on the western edge of Lansing, Michigan, in the ground that Billy Durant chose in 1920 because he trusted the people who lived near it, there is still, if you believe in such things, the echo of a line running. 3 shifts around the clock. Stars and Durants taking shape from steel and glass, and the particular ambition of a man who never learned how to stop. He was wrong about a lot of things. He was right about Lansing.